Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at where the peace process is right now. One is sort of on a diplomatic, kind of high politics level. And there, essentially, the United States is talking to the parties separately about talking to the parties separately. So that sounds actually fairly basic. I would say the other level at which to look at where the peace process is where it's at kind of with the two publics, the Israelis and the Palestinian publics. And there, actually, it's a little bit more distressing. It's not just that we're at a basic point, like we are with the high-level diplomacy, it's that we're at a pretty depressing point. Both sides essentially have pretty much checked out, the publics have checked out of the peace process, expecting very, very little from it. So the problem there is sort of a deep cynicism and mistrust that's settled in both Israeli and Palestinian society. The Obama administration came in a little bit differently from most of its predecessors. Usually, when there's been breakthroughs in the peace process on the Israeli-Palestinian front, it's been the parties themselves that have pushed it, and then the United States got into it. The Bush administration, the Clinton administration did not come in to make Israeli-Palestinian peace. When they pursued diplomacy, it was because the parties themselves had pushed it. Now we're in sort of a different kind of moment. The Obama administration came in at a time when neither the Israeli or the Palestinian leadership seemed to have much of a diplomatic process going, and they've decided this is a priority for the United States, and so that's a little bit different. If the United States wants indirect talks to start, then there will probably be indirect talks. I mean, the Israeli government has, for a long time, guarded its close security relationship with the United States and doesn't want to do anything to alienate the United States. So indirect talks don't cost very much, and so they'll cooperate. Palestinian leadership pays a slightly higher price for it because they've been cooperating with talks. This is how the Palestinian public would see it. They've been cooperating with talks now for a couple decades, and they lead nowhere while the situation on the ground gets worse. So in a sense, when Mahmoud Abbas decides to participate in talks, even if they're indirect, he does pay a little bit of a political price at home. But again, he's so dependent on the United States and on the West generally, fiscally, diplomatically, and so on, he'll probably cooperate. The problem is, once those indirect talks start, what they'll probably do a fairly good job of doing is sketching out what the issues are. But in a sense, we know what the issues are. So nobody expects them to be to lead to a breakthrough. The question is, what happens when those talks sketch out an agenda and then find out, which is what everybody expects, that there's going to be no progress in implementing the agenda? What is the next step? I don't think the United States is interested in direct talks as an end in itself. Obviously, if there's going to be an agreement, there will have to be direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians at some point. So that I would expect what the Obama administration would be doing would be using the period of indirect talks to figure out how to move to direct talks. You have to admire President Obama for coming in and deciding that this was going to be one of his priorities in a situation that did not look all that promising. But the simple fact is that he's been in office now for over a year, and on sort of a mechanical level, you were talking about indirect talks, which is, in a sense, a step backwards. And on a substantive level, the two sides are very, very far apart. I don't think you can regard the Obama efforts so far, Obama administration's efforts so far, as successful in any respect. The best he could hope for, I think, right now would be an incomplete. And an incomplete is one that should be followed with the plan of how you're going to complete the work, and that's what's missing. The idea of the United States putting forward its ideas of what the parameters of a just and fair settlement look like is a good idea. It's a good idea probably for about 15 years ago. It may simply be too late, or this may not be the time that it would do much good. The problem is that if the United States spelled out those conditions, it would probably be a set of principles that the current Israeli government couldn't accept. So it would probably lead to a problem with the Israeli government. At the same time, the Palestinians, who are much more interested in pulling in the United States in that sense. I mean, they are the weaker party, so they'd love to not face the Israelis alone. They'd love to have other parties involved. They'd love it to be the UN and UN Security Council resolutions. They can't get that. They'd love it to be the Europeans. The Israelis wouldn't put up with that. So it's got to be the United States. So they do want the United States involved. If the United States spelled out its idea of what a final settlement should look like, it would probably disappoint the Palestinians quite substantially in the issue of refugee rights. So again, even on the Palestinian side, it's not clear that it would be greeted warmly. The real problem is, what do you do with this plan when both sides say, we reject it, or even if they say yes, but, which they, again, in an effort to please the United States, they might say, how do you bring this plan into action? With the Israeli leadership really not committed to a two-state solution as the international community understands it, and with a Palestinian leadership that is weak, it's not clear what the United States could do to bring this plan to realize the plan. An Abbas visit to the United States would probably be a nice way of edging the Palestinians into talks which they're really not enthusiastic about because they expect so little from them. You know, Abbas was the first leader that Obama called right when he came into office. And the Obama administration's plans, whatever they are, seem to hinge on two individual Palestinian leaders, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and Salam Fayyad, the president of the half of the Palestinian Authority that controls the West Bank, or at least the portions of the West Bank. And so he's very, very much invested in those two particular leaders. Those two leaders have very little to show for their friendship with the United States. They can keep paying Palestinian salaries because of international financial help, but they really have nothing to show diplomatically. So it's probably a nice reward. There will be people who will be measuring exactly how Abbas gets treated versus how Netanyahu got treated, whether he'll be invited for dinner and this sort of thing. So it may be an important symbolic way of communicating sort of a close American relationship with this Palestinian leadership. Dirty truth that most Palestinians don't want to acknowledge is that the health of the Palestinian economy in the West Bank and Gaza relies on one thing and one thing only, and that's access to the outside world, which Israel essentially controls. So the better that there is movement and access in and out of the West Bank, the better there's access through Israel, the better there's access to Israeli markets, the fewer barriers, the healthier the Palestinian economy. Because of the security improvements that have taken place in the West Bank and because of very heavy American pressure on the Israeli government, there's been some lessening of the tight Israeli grip on the West Bank, and that's made possible a level of economic recovery. I wouldn't call it full economic development. What you're basically seeing is a return to the economic situation before the Intifada and the tight security controls on that Israel clamped down then, but it's still noticeable. Gaza is a different story. Gaza, you have an economy that is basically completely cut off from Israel. Some humanitarian trucks go in every day, but that's about it. They have a big difficulty exporting. They have a big difficulty importing. They can do it above ground in a limited way. They can do it. They can smuggle through underground tunnels. But again, the problem with the Gaza economy is that movement and access in and out of Gaza is a real difficulty. Hamas doesn't mind that so much as long as it can keep people fed and the government afloat, because it is actually disentangling Gaza from the Israeli economy and orienting it more towards Egypt. For Hamas, being good Palestinians and good Arabs, good Muslims, that's a better direction for them. But it's one that has a significant economic cost for Gaza short term. The problem of what to do with Gaza and Hamas is a fundamental one for any kind of approach. And the Obama administration's essential approach has been, let's deal with that later. Let's get a diplomatic process going between the Ramallah Palestinian Authority and continue to isolate Hamas, bottle it up in Gaza. And then when we get a process going, when the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank gets its feet on the ground, then we can turn our attention to the Gaza problem. The only problem with that approach is that it's not clear it's going to be any easier to deal with Gaza further down the line, and it encourages, I think, feelings on both sides that essentially drive the other part. Neither the Ramallah government nor the Gaza government, headed by Hamas, are in any hurry to pursue reconciliation. They don't see favorable terms. So that's one problem with it, is that it sort of kicks the problem down the road, and it's not clear the problem was going to get easier. There's also tremendous humanitarian cost, I mean, to the economy in Gaza. Absolutely disastrous, kept alive essentially with international assistance and some smuggling. What the Obama administration's approach there has been is to talk very quietly with the Israelis, not to end the blockade on Gaza, but perhaps to ease it a little bit, especially on basic commodities that don't seem to have much to do with security. But again, what that does is keep the population of Gaza alive and fed, but it doesn't lead to any sort of economic development. Everybody on the Palestinian side expects some time for there to be some reunification of these territories. They're very far apart politically. They're now separated geographically. In some ways, they're separate socially as well. The West Bank and Gaza are evolving in different social directions. But the idea of national unity, of Palestinian identity, is so strong. People expect the two sides to come together. It's just a question of when. And right now, neither leadership seems to be willing to make any sacrifices for it, because they're basically content where they are right now for the short term. The biggest sort of possible monkey wrench that to this sort of to the status quo would be a prisoner release deal between Israel and Hamas. Hamas holds an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, and the Israelis hold thousands of Hamas prisoners. If there were a prisoner release, that could change all sorts of things. It might be coupled with some relaxation on controls of Gaza. It might mean that the Hamas members of parliament, who've been holed up or held in Israeli prisons for at this point, some of them for 4 years, would be able to meet. Hamas would then have a parliamentary majority, and that would sort of alter the domestic Palestinian balance between Hamas and Fatah. It would mean that Hamas would have something to show. Fatah was always frustrated in its ability to get Israelis to release prisoners, and Hamas could say, you know, we held the line, we bargained a much tougher deal than you were able to get, and so forth and so on. It could lead to the release of Marwan Barghouti, who's a Fatah leader who's in Israeli prison right now, as part of the deal. So it could just completely shuffle the deck in terms of domestic Palestinian politics in ways that I don't think either side really quite understands. In terms of Palestinian institutions, I mean, I could say that there have been a whole series of attempts by Palestinians to say, let's just, whatever's going on with Israel, whatever going on with the occupation, whatever is going on with the conflict, we can still build up our own institutions and have them function and govern our own lives in whatever area we can manage. In essence, that's what the PLO was about, but it soon got caught up in international diplomacy and was really focusing far more on that diplomacy than on building anything in the West Bank and Gaza. After the Oslo Accords, there was a group of Palestinians who went in to try and build up the Palestinian Authority. Their problem there was Yasser Arafat, who didn't want to develop any kind of institutions that would limit his own authority. So once again, you had an effort that failed, and the international community, for the most part, backed Arafat, thinking it's better to have a strong Palestinian leader than one who's tied down by people who may not let him make the concessions necessary. You could say that Hamas represents that. What Hamas says is there's not going to be any peace with Israel. We've got to take things into our hands. So they're building up their own institutions in Gaza in a way that is actually impressive, even though they're not building them on the kind of basis that the international community would like to see. And then there's finally Salam Fayyad, who's essentially taking this reform program of the 1990s, the people who were trying to build up the Palestinian Authority when Arafat was alive and being frustrated by him, and saying, now's the opportunity to go ahead. We can build ministries, we can build courts, we can build a health system, school system, and we can have them operate efficiently and professionally. There's two problems with the approach. I mean, in some ways, it's very admirable, and it's the sort of thing that Palestinians should always have been doing. But there are two problems with it. First, it's essentially undemocratic. All of the democratic mechanisms of elections and so on have been robbed. So, in essence, this is something that appears to Palestinians as just happening from above. And it may be professional and it may be efficient, but it doesn't stem from the society. So it's can be a little bit alienating politically that way. And the second problem is, of course, there's a dead end in terms of the peace process. How much can the Palestinians might be able to pave streets in Ramallah or in Hebron more effectively. They may be able to collect garbage. They may be able to have better regulations about health and that sort of thing. But when it comes to movements between cities, when it comes to building in locations outside of the areas that are under complete Palestinian control, when it comes to economic measures and so forth and so on, they run right up against the fact that the West Bank is still essentially occupied territory. So there's limits in terms of what he can do. And Fayyad says, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We can build the institutions, and if they earn enough international respect, we'll get the diplomatic support necessary to expand their focus. That's where Obama may be put to the test, because he's backed this effort, and the time will come fairly soon when Fayyad will, at least according to the story he's told his own people, will turn to the international community and say, I've done exactly what I was supposed to do. Now's the time that I need your support to make sure that this can be the kernel of a Palestinian state. There were Palestinian elections in 1996 for the presidency and the parliament, but this was for a temporary structure. So nobody really thought about when do we need a second set of elections. This was supposed to be a process that was only in place for a few years. When that dragged on and on and on, finally in 2005, they passed a law mandating new elections. Abbas was elected president after the death of Arafat, but his term is now up. A parliament was elected in 2006. That brought a Hamas majority. Why haven't there been new elections? Well, essentially, Hamas and Fatah cannot agree. They can't agree on what the rules are. They don't even agree on what the law is. And there's no real mechanisms in order to implement elections. In essence, elections can't get out of the political impasse between Hamas and Fatah. Only when the two sides sit down and agree will there be elections. And neither side is really enthusiastic about going into elections right now. Fatah is not a political party that has ever been particularly skilled at elections. Hamas was more skilled last time, but the fact is their popularity has taken a big hit because of the economic situation in Gaza, so they're not anxious in facing the voters anytime soon. The American-Israeli relationship right now is, I would say, has got Israelis very nervous. Essentially, the feeling, I think, at both the level of the political elite and within the broader society is that a close relationship with the United States is absolutely essential for long-term Israeli security. that has gotten them through some tough times. Right now, they're probably more worried about the rise of Iran than they're worried about Palestinians. Again, the United States is a key actor there. They don't want to be on the wrong side with the United States. The Obama administration, by placing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so high on its diplomatic agenda, has therefore put the Israeli government in a tough position. It's got a right-wing government that is simply not interested in in moving towards what the international community would see as a two-state solution. They can talk about a two-state solution, but they rob it basically of all of its meaning. Not only are they not convinced that they want it, they're also convinced it can't happen. I mean, the Palestinian leadership is too weak. The necessary guarantees the Palestinians would have to give, they wouldn't trust, and so forth and so on. But the United States just keeps pushing on this. So what are they supposed to do? The approach of the Netanyahu government has essentially been to try and be very polite to the United States. When Netanyahu was prime minister earlier, he clashed with Bill Clinton. And this ultimately, in some ways, helped bring his government down because he couldn't manage the relationship with the United States. He's not interested in doing that again, and he's not interested in basically turning to the Israeli public and saying, look, you know, my policies, the policies of my government, have led to a crisis with Israel's closest partner. So everything on a surface level is extremely polite. But there's real nervousness in Israel about the Obama administration and about its policies. And the Obama administration seems right now to be trying to address that, trying to talk a sort of a softer language with Israel. But even when it tries to do so, for instance, when Vice President Biden went there recently, it finds some sort of a political obstacle in its path.